Star panel, including the Queen of the Red Carpet, Lizzie Cundy, and Fleet Street and radio legend Mike Porky Parry. See you at 9.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon. It's almost exactly 6 o'clock. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. The EU has announced that it's closing its airspace to all Russian planes, including private jets owned by oligarchs. The European Commission is aiming to use €450 million of EU funds to finance arms deliveries to Ukraine. An additional €50 million are meant to be spent on other equipment for Ukraine, such as medical supplies. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says she's proud of the warm welcome Europeans have given Ukrainians who fled the country.
President Zelensky's leadership and his bravery and the resilience of the Ukrainian people are outstanding and impressive. They are an inspiration for all of us. We welcome with open arms those Ukrainians who have to flee from Putin's bombs.
President Putin's order to put nuclear deterrent forces on high alert is dangerous rhetoric and irresponsible behaviour. That's according to NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg. The White House says it's part of Moscow's pattern of manufacturing threats. Chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, says Russia's timetable is not working and Putin is trying to intimidate the West.
Perhaps in a sense of almost panic by Putin in suggesting it's now firstly time for talks. That seems a bit premature given that it's only day 4, and now almost referencing the nuclear deterrent as if to somehow get us to become rattled, to intimidate us and so forth. We need to stand firm. We need to hold our ground.
Well, Ukraine's president says he needs to use every opportunity to secure peace, as his country is due to meet with Russia for peace talks. President Zelensky says he does not really believe in the outcome of the talks, but he wants to take every chance to stop the war. His office confirmed earlier that the talks are taking place on the border between Belarus and Ukraine, and that both delegations are meeting without preconditions. 368,000 Ukrainians have already fled for Poland, Moldova and other neighbouring countries. The United Nations is warning that number could grow to 4 million if fighting escalates. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has confirmed that the UK will take refugees fleeing the war. Kharkiv's governor says Ukraine is still in full control of its second largest city after Russian forces entered early this morning. Intensive rocket artillery exchanges overnight have been followed by heavy fighting in the area. The Ukrainian president said the night had been brutal, with shelling of civilian buildings. He also announced that he's setting up a foreign legion to bring in volunteers from abroad. President Zelensky also says Ukrainian forces have held off Russian troops advancing on the capital. The mayor of Kiev confirmed there are no Russian troops in his city, but says civilians can't be evacuated because the capital is now encircled and all ways out are blocked. Vitaly Klitschko said that in total, 31 people have died in the capital since the attack started, including 9 civilians, and 106 people have been injured. 900 people have now been detained by police at anti-war protests across Russia. It comes as here in the UK, thousands of demonstrators are protesting the invasion of Ukraine in London's Trafalgar Square. Many Russians have joined the rally, led by Ukrainian community leaders. They're holding up placards with messages such as "Russians do not want the war." On TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. We'll be back later on.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, the UK is looking fine and sunny with a little cloud and rain possible in the west. Let's take a look at the details. Turning cloudier in the southwest this evening. The cloud could be thick enough to bring the odd spot of rain for a time. It'll be breezy, especially along southern coast. The southeast of England will end the day with continued dry and sunny conditions for all. There'll be a brisk southerly breeze. Increasing amounts of patchy clouds will continue to spread eastwards across southern and western Wales this evening. It'll turn increasingly breezy here too. In contrast, it'll be a fine end to Sunday across all parts of the Midlands. There'll be plenty of sunshine with a rather brisky southerly breeze, feeling quite spring-like. The northeast of England will also end the day dry with plenty of sunshine. There'll be a brisk southerly wind, especially along the coast, and temperatures will dip quickly after sunset. There'll be a west-east split across Scotland this evening with dry and sunny weather for eastern areas and cloudy conditions in the west with a little rain possible. Patchy cloud and sunny spells across Northern Ireland, but thicker cloud and rain also approaching from the west throughout the evening. The winds will increase too. Cloud, rain and stronger winds will edge in from the west overnight, the rain turning heavy at times over western hills. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
You're watching GB News and this is The Political Correction.
We're here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is not about journalists talking to journalists. It's about you telling us what you think. So coming up this hour.
As hundreds of thousands of people flee Ukraine, we discuss the ongoing situation and ask, where do we go from here?
As COVID restrictions come to an end in the UK, we discuss mask wearing and self-isolation.
And we discuss new guidance in Scotland, which some campaigners have argued effectively lowers the age of consent to just 13.
And as always, we want to hear from you today, so please get involved by emailing us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction.
In the early hours of Thursday morning, Russia launched its invasion of neighbouring Ukraine.
Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have since fled the country as fierce battles continue and the death toll continues to rise.
For weeks here on The Political Correction, we've discussed the possibility of a full-scale Russian invasion. What were the initial reactions as we saw the events unfolding on Thursday? I mean, Arlene, we woke up to that horrible news that Russian troops had been deployed into Ukraine and that sort of airstrikes were taking place. Well, what were your thoughts?
Well, it was a little surreal because we had been talking about it for so long and there had been some people saying that this was all just geopolitical gameplay. There wasn't going to be an invasion. If there was going to be an invasion, it was going to be very much limited to the eastern region, the Donbass region, where there had been separatists active for 7 years since the Crimea was taken over by Russians. So I think that the scale of the invasion and the scope of the invasion, Deanna, has been really quite shocking, I think, for most people. But I have to say, our own intelligence agencies seem to be on top of the issue at the time, and that's good to see.
Yeah, I agree. And Paul, were you quite surprised by the sort of speed with which the Russian troops moved in?
Well, as you know, I was one of those sceptics. I was sceptical because, let's be blunt, the history of Western intelligence over recent years hasn't been too illustrious. You know, when you look at the predictions that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that turned out to be wrong. You look more recently at the predictions from the Western intelligence services that the Taliban wasn't going to come back into power in Afghanistan anytime soon. And obviously they were completely wrong about that. So I think a healthy dose of scepticism when you have the Western intelligence services saying to you, this is what we think is going to happen, is not necessarily a bad thing. I didn't necessarily expect the invasion to take place. I think it's a serious error by Vladimir Putin, but more importantly, it is an appalling act of aggression. There's no question about it. I think the premise on which it's been launched, you know, peacekeeping in the East is clearly bogus, and genocide against ethnic Russians in the East is also clearly bogus. Although, having said that, there is clearly some evidence of mistreatment of ethnic Russians in the East. There's no question about that. But I think, you know, there needs to be an immediate ceasefire. There needs to be the withdrawal of Russian troops, and proper diplomatic discussions need to begin on the basis of the future status of those regions of Luhansk and Donetsk in the east, on the basis of the Minsk agreement. Which now seems to sadly have fallen by the wayside. But there is no question, I say that as a sceptic, there's no question it's an appalling act of aggression that's indefensible.
Well, you talked there about sort of diplomatic solutions, and a team of Russians have arrived now in Belarus saying they're willing to start peace talks. Yet the president of Ukraine has said he's not willing to attend any peace talks in Belarus, I think for understandable reasons, given that Belarus has acted as a sort of gateway into Ukraine for those Russian troops. I mean, are we confident that even if there were peace talks in slightly more neutral territory, that they'd actually be successful, Arlene?
Well, the first thing, and Paul's already referenced this, before peace talks can take place, the Russian troops have to withdraw from the Ukraine, or from Ukraine. I nearly said the Ukraine, of course, that's the Russian way of speaking about Ukraine. They need to withdraw from Ukraine because you cannot have peace talks when you're under attack and when you're being occupied. So that's the first thing that has to happen. And then I think it's absolutely understandable that President Zelensky is saying that you can't have these peace talks in Belarus because actually some of the attacks have been launched from Belarus and actually you need to be in a neutral environment to do that. And he has suggested other environments where it could take place.
Paul, what about you? I mean, you've clearly there called for a ceasefire, which I think is something that we'd all like to see. But do you think that's actually, you know, likely given the sort of Russian aggression we've seen so far?
No, sadly, I don't. I don't think it's likely anytime soon. But obviously, that shouldn't stop the international community from making the demand. You know, so one of the things that always concerns me, and I've been involved in a lot of anti-war campaigns throughout my political activity throughout my life, and the first few days of any conflict are usually characterised by a lot of hyperbole. People get whipped up into a frenzy. We've seen, you know, some demands in this country, for example, for dual British-Russian nationals to be forced to choose one nationality, and one MP suggesting that we can deport all Russians. And I think we need to be careful of that. I think we need to keep level heads. And I do think, and I have to say this, Deanna, and it's not particularly fashionable to say it at the moment, I do think we have to place this dispute in context. There is no question that what Putin has done is utterly appalling and indefensible. But the context, unfortunately, is that, you know, NATO has been wooing Ukraine for a number of years now, despite the fact that we had previously promised Russia, NATO had previously, the Western sphere had promised Russia that NATO wasn't going to move further eastwards. And yeah, I get when people say, look, Ukraine is a sovereign country and should be entitled to enter into any alliance it sees fit. I understand that and I defend that principle. But you also have to realise that that works both ways. And, you know, the truth is that some people in Russia have seen the advance of NATO eastwards as a threat to their security. And you know, I would pose it in this way. Imagine, for example, Russia and China entered into a military alliance. And that military alliance then decided to court, let's say, Mexico on the US border. And Mexico, you know, responded to those overtures and said, yeah, we'd be quite happy to be part of your military alliance. I think the idea that the White House would say nothing about that, or would simply say, well, we defend the right of Mexico to enter into its own military alliances because it's a sovereign country, is completely fanciful. We know that is not what would happen. And indeed, it didn't happen, did it, in the 1960s when the Soviet Union tried to base missiles on Cuba. So context is important. And I do wonder whether, you know, goading Russia in the way that NATO did by continuing to move eastwards hasn't backfired on us. And that is not to in any way defend Putin. I'm utterly opposed to Putin. The man's a tyrant. But it's simply to make the point that you have to tread carefully with this sort of thing, because it can implode, and on this occasion it has done in the most tragic way. And that debate should not be off limits. We should be having that debate, in my view.
Yeah, I think we obviously should be having that debate, but of course there is no justification for Putin's aggression, Paul. I think we agree on that. And I also think that we should have a conversation about Putin's state of mind. I mean, when we look at some of the videos that he has put out there, they seem to be getting more and more aggressive. He talks about Finland and Sweden. Don't you dare think about going into NATO, or there'll be consequences. He talked about, of course, when he launched the attack on Ukraine, the need to denazify the Ukraine. I mean, that to me was a sign of something seriously wrong. And of course, given that President Zelensky is from a Jewish background, very, very offensive to the Ukrainian people. So I think we need to have a conversation as well about Putin's state of mind at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that has been, I don't quite want to say heartening, because it seems heartless to say that in the circumstances, but the number of Ukrainians who are stepping forward to sign up to defend their country. You know, there have been queues hundreds of people long to actually sign up to serve their nation in this time of real crisis. I think that's something that, you know, is actually quite inspiring. And the way the Ukrainian people have come together to back Zelensky, back the president, you know, I'm really moved by that.
It is quite moving, and when you see stars like the boxer, is he Zelensky? I think so. Anyway, his brother is the mayor of Kiev, and seeing him, Klitschko, all dressed up in his military attire, they are the plucky underdogs, I think it's fair to say. And I noticed that the Daily Telegraph was referring to them this morning as the tracksuit army, which is quite the thing. But you're right. I mean, people are volunteering, and now President Zelensky has put out a call for people to come and help them in the Ukraine, and I think that it'll be interesting to see how many people react to that. Paul, do you think people will react to that, even from the UK?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that struck me actually is, in terms of what you're saying, the number of people rallying to the defence of their country shows that actually what matters most to people is their home, their families, and their country, and those are usually the things that people are willing to put their lives on the line for. And, you know, I know we kind of live in an age where we think that those old-fashioned concepts of home and family and nation are now irrelevant. And we have people who seem to spend their time fighting for sort of abstract ideals, usually on social media in this country. But you know, when push comes to shove, people are prepared to go out and don a uniform and pick up a weapon if it's to defend their community and their loved ones and the country of which they're a citizen. And I don't think that's going to change. And some of the, already some of the heroism, I think, has been remarkable, and the willingness. You talk about the Klitschko's, Arlene, and also I think the Dynamo Kiev football team have also donned their khakis as well, and are off to fight. And in some respects, it's wonderful to see. But at the same time, I do think it's important that we don't romanticize it, because of course this is still a very gruesome war, and what we are seeing are innocent people being cut down. We're seeing lives being torn apart, and it's important that we don't in the West see it as some sort of computer game where we're just impassive bystanders. It's a very, very serious business, and the sooner it ends, the better.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, we're seeing young Russians being killed as well. So we have to remember that as well. Young boys of 17, 18, 19 being put out to fight in a war that their families probably don't want them to be involved in. Mm-hmm. So we will now turn the conversation towards the international response to the crisis. Speaking this week, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said there were some very grim days ahead for Ukraine.
So the question is, has our response been enough, and should we and other Western nations be doing more? Well, joining us to discuss this and the situation as a whole is geopolitical analyst and journalist Patrick Henningsen. Patrick, thank you for joining us this morning. What has your read been of the international response in the past few days? I think particularly now seeing the international community come together and call for Russia to be cut out of SWIFT.
I think we have to be very, very cautious about the measures that are being taken. Certainly, if you look back in history, one major faux pas was already committed by the West, in which they lobbied sanctions onto Russia just for recognizing the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. That's not against international law to recognize the independence of these two states. But yet they did that, and they signaled to Russia at that point that, we're going to sanction you anyway, and members of your parliament for voting to recognize these breakaway republics. And so Russia at that point has nothing to lose. That's basically sanctions 101 is you don't take away the incentive leverage. And the West did that immediately by going crazy with what looks like a hysterical global reaction to sanction Russia before. The United States was threatening to sanction them before anything happened. And so that's obviously a mistake, because that signaled to Russia that, might as well go ahead and execute our military objectives anyway, and our political objectives. So that's the first mistake. The second mistake would be when you get into sanctioning the central bank of a country, when you get into seizing ships on the high sea, which we saw in the last couple of days in the English Channel, that's a prelude to a wider war. And if you look at history and you study it, this is exactly what happens when you start to interfere with commerce on the high seas in this way. And then there's the collective punishment aspect of it. Sanctions don't work. Look at any other example of this, from Iran to Syria. And there's so many other examples. They actually don't work over time, because if you're still threatening a country, there's no incentive for them to change their behavior if you do lobby sanctions. That's just like basic sanctions theory, but it's amazing how our politicians haven't read the textbooks at all. They just use it as a sort of cudgel to think that they're going to change a country's behavior when in fact they don't. So from that point of view, I think it's a very dangerous road we're going on here, and basically sanctioning world leaders so they can't travel for negotiations. This might become a problem, because if Ukraine and Russia can't sit at a table because they can't meet in Switzerland or they can't meet in Germany or some other neutral place, then the conflict will drag on. And so that's going to add to the complications and the problems. These things aren't often thought about, unfortunately, by our political leaders. So there's that aspect of it. And also, there's no context to this at all. The United Nations Resolution 2202 was backing the Minsk Accords. That was the mandate of the United Nations. And that's 7-8 years dragged on. And the guarantors of that, Germany and France, in the Normandy format, they didn't enforce it. And Ukraine's open position was they're not going to abide by the Minsk Accords, which was mandated by the UN, which was to de-escalate and have a ceasefire in the Donbass. They just abandoned it. And now the Western media and Western politicians are accusing Russia of of walking away from the Minsk Accords, and that's the opposite of what actually happened. So in this information environment, we have two different narratives, two completely polar opposite narratives being spoken of in the West and by Russia. There's very little chance that I think that we're going to get any diplomatic resolution on this. It's a very dangerous environment when both sides are not listening to each other, and provable falsehoods are being spoken by leaders, in this case, by Western leaders as well. So this is not a really positive situation in that respect.
So I suppose my question in response, Patrick, is if you fear that sanctions at this stage are the wrong approach, then what would you consider the right approach to be from Western leaders?
The right approach would have been to follow the United Nations directive on the Minsk peace process. Then we wouldn't have gotten to this point to begin with. And at every turn, the United States actively undermined that. Britain pretty much looked the other way, acted like they didn't know anything about it. No pressure was put on Kiev to realize this peace process. There's 14,000 residents in the Donbass have been killed, residents and soldiers on both sides. So collectively, 14,000 victims, many of them civilians, and are being shelled to this day still. This is Russia's beef. And I find it amazing that this context is not even being spoken of on any mainstream media outlet in the West or from any politician. It's almost like they've canceled the people of the Donbass. They've kind of like disappeared them. They've dehumanized them in that sense. So these are people that have been under siege, as it were, from the Ukrainian military, from their own government in a bloody civil war for 8 years. That counts for nothing in the current discourse in the West. It's quite astonishing. So of course they're not going to be able to communicate with Moscow on this. So what's Moscow looking at this and saying? Well, they don't care about the United Nations resolution. They don't care about the people of the Donbass. They don't care about the humanitarian disaster, the embargo. They've taken out electric. The Ukrainian army has hit the water supply. They've blockaded food going in there. I mean, it's a dire situation. And now the West is saying we need to ship weapons into the Ukraine, more weapons, more arms. And so that's effectively a proxy war, NATO versus Russia, using the Ukraine as the proxy. So any way you add it up, that's how it is on paper. So I really can't understand how this conversation hasn't developed to any kind of a sober.
One of the great things about GB News, Patrick, is that we can have these conversations and go places that the other news channels don't. Well, I'm afraid our time is up, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And we'll go quickly to a break, after which we will be speaking about the threat of war in countries bordering Russia and Ukraine. So don't go anywhere.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. And as ever, many of you have been getting in touch with us. Arlene?
So, yeah, we've had a wide range of views sent in, and that's the good thing about GB News, that we get a wide range. Ian says the best thing for both sides in this conflict is a speedy resolution. It may not be as feel-good as showing civilians taking up arms to defend, but in reality, urban conflict will lead to stalemate and mass death. I hope for the people of Ukraine it doesn't come to this.
Lucy here saying, a lesson we can all learn from Ukraine. NATO's not enough. Britain needs to properly invest in our armed forces so we can stand on our own 2 feet. We can't hide behind America forever.
And then on the issue of sanctions, Lily says sanctions are tricky. We want to hurt Putin and his gangster cronies, but could end up hurting decent, ordinary Russians as well. If Russia retaliates, ordinary Brits will be affected too.
And then we've got Dan here, and this is one that our next guest might quite enjoy. Thank goodness for Mark White and GB News. So much fake news about the conflict on social media. Well, you'll be pleased to know, GB News viewers, that the next person we're going to be talking to is our very own Mark White.
I'm blushing.
You're blushing. You're blushing.
All right.
Mark, this has been obviously a difficult few days for Ukraine and Russia, but maybe you could bring us up to date on where we are now.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the operation, the viewer that has written in there talks about the misinformation. There is a lot of misinformation. It's always confusing in these situations. And all we can do is try to attribute what claims are coming out to whoever is making those claims. So be it the Russian government, the Ukrainian government, or indeed the British Ministry of Defence. And I'm finding this quite helpful, actually. The MOD here in the UK have started putting out an intelligence analysis of the situation that they see on the ground, which I think from our point of view, it strikes me as being one of the more credible routes to look into what's going on. They clearly have intelligence assets on the ground. They have satellite imagery. They are in contact with those forces, of course, of the Ukrainian armed services involved in the fighting as well. Now, what they say is that Vladimir Putin's forces have not made the kind of progress that they would have hoped to make. Their day one objectives, according to James Heapy, the Armed Forces Minister yesterday, were not met. And that even today, any attempts to take over Ukrainian cities for the most part have not been met. We are hearing about some very intense fighting in Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. 1.5 million people in northeastern Ukraine. It's only about 20 miles or so from the Russian border. There has been intense shelling and rocket fire in and around that city in the last couple of days. Now we are getting credible reports of Russian tanks on the ground in the city, engaged in street-to-street fighting with the Ukrainian armed forces and local militia there. So very worrying situation there.
And I think we talked about this on Friday, Mark. The social media element to all of this is really important, isn't it? We're seeing a lot of videos coming out from the Ukrainian side, some from the Russian side, and people should be careful about some of that, shouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to be careful with the imagery that we're showing and waiting until you get legitimate and credible news organisations like Reuters or Associated Press verifying images and putting them out. We'll take it from there. I'm not saying we're not taking any imagery from social media. If we can verify it ourselves, we'll try to do that. But the fact is there has been some images that are circulating purporting to show fighting and incidents of very worrying significance that are actually taken from previous conflicts some years ago. So we just have to be very careful on that. It is no doubt, though, there is no doubt that the situation there is very, very difficult on the ground. There is significant incursions from Russian forces in various parts of Ukraine. There has been an air bombardment from Russia as well, involving missiles, aircraft, and shelling from troops on the ground into areas that contain populations. Now, Russia say that they are not deliberately targeting residential areas, but we've seen imagery verified that's come out that shows residential areas that have been struck. It's always a risk when you are involved in fighting in urban centres. Then there is always a risk that residential areas are going to get struck like this.
Mark, thank you so much for coming in and giving us that update on where we are at the moment. And as the Ukrainian assault continues, citizens of surrounding countries will be wondering how far Putin will go and whether they will be next.
Millions in Eastern Europe await answers to that question. How fearful will these countries be as the invasion rages on? Well, certainly, it must be incredibly worrying to be just on the edge of a war zone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously, Belarus is quite supportive of the Russian invasion. Some of the attacks came actually from Belarus into Ukraine, but there are a number of other countries such as Poland, Hungary, even Moldova, and I'm sure they're wondering what their future is and worrying about what's going on in their neighbouring country.
Estonia as well, another nation that's often spoken of. And Estonia, of course, the victim of a Russian cyber attack back in, I think, 2007, which took down websites of their sort of main news sources and the banks, and really sort of crippled their nation for a good couple of days there.
The fear, Paul, that must exist not only in Ukraine but also in the neighbouring countries must be tangible at the moment. And we've seen a movement of people, tens of thousands of people from Ukraine into the neighbouring countries, but they too must be very worried.
Well, I think, as you touched on earlier, Arlene, there have to be question marks over Putin's state of mind, frankly, because I think this is an extremely foolish escapade tactically on his part, apart from the violation of territory and the fact that it's a war crime, effectively. You do have to wonder about what state of mind he's in, and therefore people on the borders probably are concerned, even, I would guess, those Baltic states that are now part of NATO, so the likes of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, etc. But also, I think, probably countries like Finland and Sweden, because when it was raised a couple of days ago about the possibility in response to the Russian attack on Ukraine for Finland and Sweden to join NATO as a means to defending their own security, the message from Moscow is that would not come without consequences. Now, that is completely unacceptable. Those are independent nation states, and as I said before, they have the right to join NATO. But I do come back to this point that we do have to look at our own role in where we ended up today. I mean, there's one person who deserves the blame for the invasion of Ukraine, and that is, of course, Vladimir Putin, no question about it. But we do, I think, need to learn lessons to give ourselves the best opportunity of making sure this type of thing doesn't happen again in the future. And I think context is important. And I think NATO probably does have to look in the mirror and think about its own actions in terms of the way that it did consistently over recent years make overtures towards Ukraine, in a way that some Russians did see that as a threat to their interests. So, and I think also, by the way, I mean, and this is something we haven't touched on yet, in 2014, an elected leader of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown by what was really a violent mob made up, certainly in part, of ultra-nationalists. And he was a leader who was looking towards Moscow rather than looking towards the West, and the EU and NATO didn't like that. So, we were quite happy to stand back at that point. And allow, as I say, stand back. Some people might say we were actually complicit in allowing that mob to overthrow that democratically elected leader, who, by the way, was not perfect and he had many, many faults. So again, that is something that we were party to at the time. And for all our talk about defending international sovereignty, it seems to me that we're quite happy to interfere when it suits us. There's a massive backstory to this whole debate, which I don't think is being aired particularly in the media. I'm glad that we're doing it, because I think we do need to have that wider debate.
I think you're right, Paul, about the point of kind of looking ahead and ensuring that we do learn lessons from this, not least in terms of kind of global supply chains, because one of the potentially devastating impacts that this could have is on kind of global gas prices, something that we're already very concerned about in this country given the cost of living. And so once again, it can tie back to the debate we've had many times on this show about whether we're resilient enough as a nation. And I know we were speaking before the show about whether this actually is an argument that maybe we shouldn't be globalising. We should actually be looking more towards deglobalising. And
I know Paul has talked about globalisation many times on the show, and there's a very interesting article by Janet Daly in the in the Sunday Telegraph today about is globalisation one of the reasons why we're not able to respond to what has happened in Ukraine. I know, Paul, you'll want to answer that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's my view that the world really needs to de-globalise, and I don't mean that we should all go into our shells and not cooperate with the world around us and with our fellow nation states, but certainly in terms of things like global supply chains, I think that our over-reliance on global supply chains has clearly come at a very, very big cost, and we're about to see that, I suspect. And also the destruction of our own industrial base. And I think we're about to see with the impacts of this war and the impact on gas prices potentially, and the fact that we now have no independent energy security in this country, and we're reliant on the likes of Russia and Norway. I think we saw it during the COVID pandemic as well, in terms of PPE and the fact that we had no manufacturing base in this country and we were relying on stuff coming from abroad, and the impact that sort of thing has on the environment as much as anything else. So it's long been my view that we do need to deglobalize a bit, that we need to defend our own domestic industrial base, that we need to forget about the long supply chains and rely more on local supply chains so far as we can. And we need to probably see again the value of the independent nation state. Now, whenever I've argued that, particularly from a point of view of being on the left, I've always been hammered by the kind of liberal globalizers who think that's a terribly xenophobic and reactionary view to take. But I suspect that even those people very soon will be realising that it's probably the way we need to start going, because the cost will be enormous.
Yeah, so shortening supply chains and dealing with our energy supply, I think, will become really important. So coming up after the break, we're discussing the end of COVID restrictions in the UK, so don't go anywhere.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, Well, this week, COVID restrictions in England officially came to an end, with self-isolation no longer legally required if you test positive for the virus.
Some critics have said the plans failed to protect the most vulnerable in society. Others believe it's time to completely move on and leave this saga behind us for good. And of course, in England that has happened, but in other regions of the UK, as you will know, Deanna, there are still requirements in relation to what happens, albeit they're mostly in guidance now, I think, instead of that.
Well, I must say, as a Conservative, it has been really wonderful to hear our Prime Minister and our ministers talking about personal responsibility again.
Yes.
Talking about a sort of return to normality and asking people to act sensibly. Though I think there are a few people now sort of unsure what to do. You know, if you were to test positive for COVID, should you go into the office? Should you not? I mean, what would you do, Arlene?
Well, I mean, I think it's common sense that if you test positive for COVID and it's very transmissible, you would stay. Well, I would stay at home. It's a bit like if you get a virus or a bug and you're unwell, you stay at home because you don't want to pass it on to colleagues. I think that is common sense, and I think it's personal responsibility. Very much what the PM has been talking about.
Yeah, I'm with you, actually. I think if I was to sort of test positive, knowing the amount of people that I've come into contact with, certainly in Parliament, which is always a hive of activity, I probably would stay home. And I guess different workplaces will have kind of different regimes and rules. What about you, Paul? If you tested positive tomorrow, what would you be doing?
I agree. I mean, I think you ought to kind of treat it as any other serious respiratory virus. So, for example, if you had a serious dose of flu, you probably wouldn't, I mean, it's different if you have a sniffle, but if you've got a serious dose of it, then probably you wouldn't go into work and you wouldn't mix with friends, etc. And you certainly wouldn't go into the company of anybody vulnerable. So in that respect, I think that those rules should apply. I mean, there will always be circumstances where perhaps people don't have much choice in the matter, but so far as it's possible, then of course you should try to avoid people. But I agree that it was right and proper to lift the restrictions. I mean, my concern for a long time now is that we had effectively scared the population so witless about this virus that it was always going to be the case that whenever we moved out of the restrictions, a number of people were going to be afraid of it. And I think that's been shown to be the case. But previously, you know, when we lifted the restrictions last July, and people said it was going to result in thousands of deaths, that didn't happen. When we didn't impose the restrictions at Christmas, when many people said we should have done, otherwise it was going to result in thousands of deaths, again, that didn't happen. So I think the evidence is overwhelmingly in favour of lifting the restrictions, allowing people to live their own lives, taking sensible measures where people do test positive for COVID. And going forward, I think we need to reassess whether or not lockdown was the right thing from the beginning, because the truth is, as the Johns Hopkins University report that was published a few weeks ago but got barely any traction in the media showed that lockdowns came at an enormous cost. They estimated, the academics, that it reduced COVID-related deaths lockdown by about 0.2%. But the societal and economic cost, and the cost in terms of other health implications for people, was truly enormous. And I don't think we've properly had that debate yet. But yes, rejoice, lift the restrictions, and let us live our normal lives, please.
Notice people kind of really embracing the freedom, you know, in terms of like public transport and in the supermarket. I certainly feel as though a lot of people have been kind of ditching the masks now and really wanting to feel that normality. But have you both seen that reflected as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've been in London this weekend and it's amazing. I was here a couple of weeks ago and people were still generally wearing their masks on the tube and on the train. Now, very, very few people are wearing masks. And you know what? If people want to wear masks, that's a matter for them. If it makes them feel more comfortable, fine, that's okay. But I think most people, certainly 80% of people on the tube when I was on it, weren't wearing any masks.
And have you noticed the same thing, Paul?
Yeah, I sensed actually that the mask wearing was dying off some time ago. I mean, you know, I think there are question marks over just how effective masks are, to be perfectly blunt. But yeah, I mean, I use a tube from time to time and public transport, and it seems to me that most people now will not be wearing a mask. And yeah, I can completely understand if someone's in the vulnerable category, why they think they ought to wear a mask. But again, it's got to be down to individual choice. People are entitled to make that choice, and you know, we should respect the choice of others as well. We should have frankly done that from the beginning, in my view.
I think it raises quite an interesting question, though, in terms of how much influence the state and the government have had and should have over kind of people's lives, people's movements, and those sort of behavioural norms as well. Because obviously, at the heart of the lockdown, when we were still learning about the virus, I think people very much accepted the sort of restrictions. And I think compliance sort of died off a little bit as time went along. But I think there are still people calling for kind of clearer government guidance when actually isn't the stance be sensible. We know so much about the virus now, it's time to be sensible.
But I think, Diana, that's because a lot of people were told what to do during those lockdown times, and they're now saying, well, what do we do now? What do we do? And people are actually wanting the government to tell them what to do when they go out of their front door, which I find quite unnerving, actually. People should use their common sense. If they want to wear a mask, that's fine, you wear a mask, but if you don't have to. And I think that's the important message of personal responsibility. Anyway, moving on then, the government has further ramped up its battle against online harms, with more measures to tackle trolling and abuse from anonymous accounts.
Conservative MP for Stroud Siobhan Bailey has succeeded in ensuring the new measures will make provision for those suffering at the behest of users who hide their identities as part of a wider legislative crackdown on online abuse.
Well, joining us now to discuss this is Victoria Hewson, the Head of Regulatory Affairs, I can nearly say it, at the Institute for Economic Affairs. You're very welcome to the show, Victoria. Perhaps you could tell us what changes are being made to the legislation to tighten up on anonymous abuse.
Yes, thanks, Eileen. Well, this bill was already extremely long and complicated. You know, I've been a technology lawyer for 13 years or more, and I found the bill already rather complicated and difficult to interpret and apply. And now the Secretary of State has announced that they will be laying on even more complex multi-layered restrictions, and these ones in particular concern the a mandate for platforms to allow people to cut out anonymous accounts from seeing them in their timeline or popping up on their Facebook feed. Now, what that means is that if you want the full range of reach on these platforms, that you will have to identify yourself. So the idea is you could still probably use a pseudonym or a nickname to make your postings, but you would have to be linkable to a verified actual named individual, which for me is actually introducing digital ID by the back door, because you will have to essentially prove your identity before you can participate in online debates in the normal course. So I think that's a rather worrying development. And then there's some other, frankly, to me, magical thinking ideas about how platforms should offer some kind of ability for users to dial up and down their appetite for seeing, quote, harmful content, which again brings into question all of these really difficult aspects of terminology that the bill rests on about this idea of harmful content. Legal but harmful content has been one of the most controversial aspects of the bill that the government wants platforms to manage. But of course, how do you define what's legal but harmful, and actually what business is it of the government to try and control lawful speech being shared and received by individuals in social media?
I think one of the difficult, you're so right that the harmful but legal is a really difficult kind of line to tread. But when it comes to actual threats and real vile abuse, I think one of the difficulties at the moment under existing legislation is that there is actually no onus on social media companies to even necessarily provide IP addresses. And so in terms of actually using the law as it sits at the moment and being able to actually catch people who are issuing threats, is this not a really positive step forward?
I think that I certainly have a lot more sympathy for the aspects of the bill that are trying to deal with illegal content. Where I struggle a bit with that, though, is that the definition of illegal content is also being expanded to include the new classes of hate crime, much of which is going to be very difficult for platforms to identify. Or, as it stands at the moment in the bill, all they would need to have would be a reasonable suspicion that a particular piece of content constitutes for example, a stirring up of racial hatred. Well, the way that works currently is that there are lots of safeguards built into the system for the police to investigate these things, the Crown Prosecution Service to have a look at it, even the Attorney General in some cases has to get involved. And so the idea that a platform is going to be able to run algorithms, or even human moderators, frankly, are not going to be able to make very good determinations of pieces of content that may or may not cross this line into being illegal content, and will invariably err on the side of caution because they have potentially billions of pounds of revenue at stake in fines. So I think I would be more relaxed about this if it was really only about countering violent crime or child sexual abuse and exploitation. But actually the government is actively throwing in hate crimes and the new communications offences, actually, which include causing psychological harm or even just potential psychological harm to someone. So even if you do just restrict it to actual criminal or unlawful content, we're already in some trouble, I think, on a freedom of expression perspective.
Mm-hmm. I suppose the difficulty with all of this, Victoria, is the fact that on one hand you've got the freedom of speech argument, and on the other hand you have the safety and security of women and young people in particular. And we know that there are some young people who have taken their own lives as a result of anonymous trolling and attempts to blackmail them and what have you. So it's where we settle on those two issues, and I think Parliament's trying to do that, but have they got it right is the question, and you're questioning the harmful piece and the definition. Isn't that the issue?
Well, it is, but I also think there is a wider question here about the concept of safety. And obviously with children, it's very different. And on that, I would actually say we're in danger of lulling families into a false sense of security that the internet has been made safe. And actually, surely, the primary responsibility for making sure children are safe when they are looking at the internet in their own home or wherever, that has to rest with the families. And I think there's a real danger that we are, taking responsibility away from the parents who will, as I say, perhaps be lulled into a false sense of security that the state is taking care of all of this and you don't need to be looking out for what your children are looking at online. And that could actually be quite counterproductive, as well as sort of really stripping the family of an important responsibility, which again is an important conservative value that I think is slightly being lost here. And then in terms of, adults being protected from harmful content, things that might have hurt their feelings. And the definition of harm here is really, the threshold is rather low. The psychological harm threshold could just mean feeling a bit upset, maybe being made to cry, which is clearly not a very nice experience to go through. And I've been upset by interactions on social media before. But I wouldn't expect the person who's upset me to necessarily be censored at source as a result of that.
Yeah, I understand that, but I suppose, like all bullying that takes place of young people, the parents very rarely know that it's happening until the young person finds the strength to come forward and tell them about it. So, unfortunately, online bullying is no different, and online threats. And I think both Deanna and I, having been the subject of online threats, know the difference between threats and harmful content, in terms of just being nasty and unpleasant.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, the UK is looking fine and sunny with a little cloud and rain possible in the west. Let's take a look at the details. Turning cloudier in the southwest this evening. The cloud could be thick enough to bring the odd spot of rain for a time. It'll be breezy, especially along southern coast. The southeast of England will end the day with continued dry and sunny conditions for all. There'll be a brisk southerly breeze. Increasing amounts of patchy clouds will continue to spread eastwards across southern and western Wales this evening. It'll turn increasingly breezy here too. In contrast, it'll be a fine end to Sunday across all parts of the Midlands. There'll be plenty of sunshine with a rather brisky southerly breeze, feeling quite spring-like. The northeast of England will also end the day dry with plenty of sunshine. There'll be a brisk southerly wind, especially along the coast, and temperatures will dip quickly after sunset. There'll be a west-east split across Scotland this evening, with dry and sunny weather for eastern areas and cloudier conditions in the west with a little rain possible. Patchy cloud and sunny spells across Northern Ireland, but thicker cloud and rain also approaching from the west throughout the evening. The winds will increase too. Cloud, rain and stronger winds will edge in from the west overnight, the rain turning heavy at times over western hills. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Hello, mate. Step into the studio, please.
How are you keeping? Busy?
I've got a brand new show coming on GB News called The Friday Night Feast.
Oh, yeah?
I'm going to take a new news angle on the week's biggest stories. Move it forward. I want to talk about what I think we should be talking about, not what we're being told that we have to. Right, well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it. A brand new show right here on GB News. The Friday Night Feast, 7 p.m. until 9 p.m. with me, Patrick Christie's. What could possibly go wrong, eh? Oh, I've left my wallet in a cab.
On Mark Dolan tonight, my Mark Meets guest is politician, best-selling author and reality star Anne Widdecombe. Whether it's the migrant crisis, Vladimir Putin, a proper Brexit or the BBC, we'll be playing a game of What Would Anne Do? In the big question, has COVID killed the NHS? And in my big opinion monologue, I just don't trust the people running